afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the latest instalment of GFM Talks. Today, we are going to be talking about inclusion across the GFM, having the opportunity to share with you the journey we've been on as a team and as the organisation has been on. So using research and our knowledge of learners in the school, this session will support us all in developing our next steps and developing, hopefully by the end of it, a chance for you to reflect on your role in ensuring that every aspect of our work is inclusive as possible. So we have 3 clear ambitions set by the board that we are all to work towards as an organisation. So we need to develop the all through 0 to 25 provision, making sure that we are encompassing opportunities for all young people to develop their personal ambitions and go on to be successful in whatever their next steps might be. Develop a curriculum that enables all children to feel successful and develop their skills, both academically, socially and emotionally. And lastly, to build an inclusive community, so beyond the GFM, underpinned by those gospel futures and supporting our community to develop as lifelong learners. I'm now going to hand over to Faye, who's going to tell you a little bit more.
Thank you, Kerry. So I want to start by asking us really, what methods of research are you using in your school or in your setting to support teaching and learning in your classroom? And I want to use the Pupil Premium strategy as an example of how we've used research to really drive and develop the strategy that we have for each of the independent settings, as well as the MAT policy. We've looked at research and identified what it's told us, what we've learned from it, and frequently review that research to drive the spend and to think about how we use those different activities within the strategy across the 2, 3, 4, 5 years that we have this put into place. We tend to make huge reference to the books that you'll see across the screen, and we use the EEF as one of the main drivers of research to think about how we identify youngsters in terms of their needs and not in terms of their labels. So we think about a long-term approach, think about socioeconomic disadvantage and it being a really long-term issue for us to address. This is not a quick fix. And we think about how the research can drive some of the strategies that we put into place. I want us to think about us as classroom practitioners and the impact we can have on those youngsters within the classroom. I want us to think about our disadvantaged cohort and that tier 1 support that every adult that supports those youngsters can put into place. Now, whether we work inside the classroom or outside of the classroom with those learners, I want us to think about every interaction with every pupil being an intervention. Next slide. Massive thank you to all of you that have been involved in the recent Impact Ed Assessment 2. We've had over 3,000 responses, which has been absolutely fantastic. This is a tool that I found back in May 2020, and we spoke about it as an organisation and how we could use this to really give us evidence-informed information that was completely child-centred. It was a way that we were able to gauge what our youngsters were feeling and gather that really important data that we could then respond to based on need. It tells us about how our youngsters are feeling. It asks about well-being at school. It gives them the opportunity to rate themselves on a scale of 1 to 5 about those feelings of well-being. It asks them to report on metacognition. How are they working and learning independently? With the huge changes we've had to education post and post-COVID, working through COVID, we've looked at youngsters working remotely. There is an assumption that every youngster can access that learning remotely, and that isn't the case. So it's really important that we look at the information that our youngsters are telling us about how they have developed those metacognition skills or how we can further support them to develop those skills. We also look at levels of what is classed as anxiety. I completely appreciate anxiety is a condition, but we're talking about that worry, why youngsters may be worrying in school, what are the barriers to learning potentially that could be linked to worrying. And this has given us a really large amount of important information. And I'm hugely excited about how we're going to roll that out now through tutors, through assemblies, and then into the classroom to look at that real tier 1 support that we can give our youngsters to kind of mitigate the risk where there are some barriers to learning. I'm going to hand over to Paul now. Thank you.
Hello. So one of the focuses is on social, emotional, and the whole child outcomes. So there's links between emotional and mental health needs and assessing the learning. So Maslow's old, but he does capture this quite well. So there's a careful balance between to support the needs of the learner and also the high expectation of our young people themselves. So what's clear when we look at the evidence is that we are working with a range of learners with complex needs. So we've had over 350 diagnostic hub referrals, and out of those 350, we've identified that 97% of these referrals for additional support in the first 2 terms are requesting social, emotional, and mental health support. So this is a situation which is really tricky, but we also need to support each other to support our learners to work through this and tackle this together. So we're really fortunate at the GFM to have the tier 2 and tier 3 areas of support, which colleagues will go into shortly, but we just need to focus on tier 1 at the moment. So if we can get the tier 1 support right for our learners with emotional and mental health needs first, that will take the pressure off the tier 2 and tier 3 support programs. So our diagnostic tools at the moment are telling us about the whole child. This is absolutely invaluable in ensuring that the correct support is given to and prioritised for the learners that need it the most. So these tools allow us a range of different skills. So to look at potential barriers to learning, and we can identify what the barriers are and support the youngsters to remove some of those barriers, which would then support them with some of their emotional, social, and mental health difficulties. As a reactive to this, we can see that we do have a range of needs, and our learners also have a range of needs. We're looking at where we can invest some of the linked funding to the students to make sure that they have the resources they need to hand. So one of the things we have stepped into at the moment is looking at our trauma-informed practitioners. We have 5 of these across the trust at the moment, and they are providing invaluable support to our learners, but we recognise that we do need more. And this is to support our youngsters who have more than 4 ACEs scores on average, who are more likely to die 20 years prior their peers. So as a reaction to this, we are looking at training some more of our trauma-informed practitioners to sit in those higher tiers of support. So what is vital when allocating provision is making sure that the provision is suited to the needs of the learner. And what we need to do is look at the results, look at the evidence which is given to us through the diagnostic tools we use, and making sure that it's on a need basis. So when we look at the child, we don't necessarily look at groups of children in terms of disadvantage or whether they're SEND. We look at all of the children together, and where there's a need, is where we will put the support as priority. So in order to do this, it needs to be sustainable. So we are looking at creating sustainable models of staffing and provision across the trust, which will help us in being creative when finding solutions for our learners. So off the back of the numbers of adverse childhood experience questionnaire, we're now prioritising funding to train up to 8 members of staff and trauma-informed practitioners who will be able to support our youngsters, along with the other offers we have in our other tiers and waves of intervention, such as the walled garden, community kitchen, and atelier. I'm now handing over to myself and Faye, so I'm now continuing. So looking at the needs of the youngsters, one of the things we do look at is the needs of learning and their academic, because some of our youngsters within the GFM face the social, emotional, and mental health barriers because they are worried about their learning. So one of the things we do as part of our diagnostic is looking at their scores for literacy, for reading, and for maths, and seeing those scores, comparing them across the GFM and comparing them nationally. So when you see us, I'm talking about the Renaissance reading and maths assessments, along with other diagnostic assessments we do, such as the Sandwells. These really inform us about the child's academic ability and identifies any gaps which then may be a barrier to them accessing the learning and support their social, emotional, and mental health difficulties. So it's about looking at their academic ability and trying to plug the gaps where we can. And obviously, our scores enable us to do that in support with Bedrock. I'm now handing over to Faye.
Thank you, Paul. So just to build on that then, the standardised assessments that we use allow us to benchmark across those age groups and to look at where youngsters may be struggling to access the curriculum, whether that's in one subject area or whether that's across a range of areas. Again, building on that research, we look at ENFA and the building block 4 that seeks for us to understand those gaps in learning and then seek the best strategies to support the child's next steps. And as we always need to remember, one size doesn't fit all. That may be very different for different youngsters within and outside of the classroom. We've talked a lot already about the offer meeting need. We need to recognise that this has changed, and this does change, and it's quite reactive based on the needs of cohorts. Society is changing day to day. Cohorts of youngsters are rapidly changing, and our offer needs to make sure it meets the needs of those youngsters. There is a recognition that a 39-week is no longer a school year as we class it, and that actually it's not suitable for the needs of all of our different learners. And therefore, we've responded to that by offering different support throughout holiday periods for identified groups of youngsters. That may be linked to wellbeing, it could be linked to academic intervention to really support those youngsters. It could be about checking in with a youngster and allowing them to have that feeling of belonging through a long period of the summer holidays. We've looked at the school day extending. We know that a 9 till 3 day, there's no such thing anymore, but we're starting to think about what does that 8 o'clock to 5 o'clock day look like? What will Breakfast Club look like when that's launched for the all, enabling our youngsters to come in, have some food, talk to a member of staff, maybe do some reading, but actually have a really positive start ready for the day at school. We've had a sixth form mentor offer that's offered across both phases, so primary and secondary, and thinking about the love of reading and actually having youngsters that are older but still within our organisation working and mentoring some of our younger youngsters in the organisation. We've offered a Saturday morning King's Camp opportunity for youngsters that were really struggling with leadership skills, teamwork skills and social interaction, that were run by an external company that was supported by members of our sixth form mentors. So those trusted adults were there really to support the youngsters and engaging them in becoming part of a team. We've looked at our transition offer, and we are now probably more reactive than we ever have done and responding to the needs of our youngsters and thinking about what it is that's going to allow them to come in, feel part of our organisation and actually be secondary ready. So we're thinking about everything we offer, whether it's inside of the classroom or outside of the classroom, being linked to need. Thank you, Megan. Next slide. So with regards to professional learning, I want us to think about the fact that we are all teachers of learners and every learner will experience some form of disadvantage. We've been thinking a lot about how we can continue to work together to ensure we are offering high quality professional learning that has an impact both within the classroom and on the outcome of our learners. And this is something we will continue to drive. So I won't apologise when inclusion do take the lead and do have that slot at lots of our professional learning sessions that we have already had and that we follow through. We really want to continue to think about that teaching standard 5 being an absolute priority. Every child, the best possible place for them to be is in the classroom. We absolutely want that for all, but we do recognise at times there are needs that mean we need to have that additional support as a level of tier 2. But that tier 1 is so very, very important. We've looked at whole school and also whole trust level professional learning. So we're not just thinking phase specifically, but we're thinking about us as an organisation. We're using the best possible research, the most up-to-date research that indicates, as it has done for several years and will continue to do, that great teaching is the most important lever that schools have to improve pupils' attainment. And that is both academic attainment and progress and attainment for the learner as a whole child. It's really important we consider how children learn with teaching approaches that ensure long-term progress, long-term retention of knowledge and fluency in skills, and also enable our youngsters to be confident in learning and to really develop those metacognitive skills. We again used the Roland Pupil Premium information and research that talks to us about if we look at the life of a disadvantaged learner and look through the lens of a disadvantaged learner, we will enable all to make progress and to achieve goals within the classroom. Thank you, Megan. So I want to use our Pupil Premium strategy as a little example here about how we tier a strategy to think about really meeting the needs of our youngsters. And we've looked at 3 strands. And those 3 tiers you will see are listed 3, 2 and 1. And we're thinking about the youngster as a whole always. And there are 3 different stages that we will look at supporting our youngsters, and we will go through those really shortly. We've identified challenges, not barriers. So we don't want to say to youngsters that's an absolute barrier. We're going to talk about challenges when we talk to our youngsters. And we've identified intended impact pre-activity. And what I would say is we are very reflective in our approach, and that we are always happy to measure and evaluate impact where there hasn't been the impact we would have expected, to reflect again and think about how we may remodel something, how we will develop the strategy that we already have in place. Handing over to Paul now, please. Thank you.
So I'm going to talk a little bit about Tier 3 now and our wider community. So Tier 3 is the tiers of intervention where everything at Tier 1 and Tier 2 has already been trialled, but hasn't necessarily had the desired impact we would want. Tier 3 is in an exciting stage at the moment as we're continuing to develop and expand on our range of different Tier 3 provisions, because ultimately we want to be one of the most inclusive, if not the most inclusive, collection of schools throughout the UK, and take on the mantra of actually, if not here, then where? Where does it better than us? Nowhere, we do it the best. And that's what we want to be. We want to make sure that no matter what the need of the learner is, we have a resource or a provision in place so we can help them to meet their needs. So at the moment, we've got a range of different provisions in our Tier 3 that we can offer our youngsters who have already had the quality first teaching within the classroom, who have tried some of our Tier 2 provisions and are really at that stage now where we need to give them something more bespoke. So a range of our Key Stage 4 learners at the moment do have access to St Vincent's College, where they have this bespoke learning programming, where they're able to learn some multi-skills courses, where they're doing plastering, joinery, learning about how to construct guttering and a range of different things like this. So that just gives them pathways where we recognise that actually they may not be the most academic of people. They may not be able to leave here with their 8s and 9s in English and maths, but we can see they've got a skill set that is required. They've got a career, a pathway and a future, which is in practical learning. So that's what we can try and provide and put in place for them. We've also got a range of learners now who are part of a bespoke curriculum, where we recognise that actually the Monday to Friday, 9 till 3 in school, accessing learnings in the old Victorian model isn't a way that actually is best for them. So we've got some fantastic resources, including our walled garden, our community kitchen and our atelier, that build up some of the support packages around them as learners. We've also got our Cube provision, which supports our learners who are really struggling to engage with school. Maybe there's been a breakdown in relationships between school and home. They just have heightened anxiety. And this has been really reflected through the pandemic, where youngsters haven't been expected to leave their homes. They haven't been expected to engage with other peoples beyond their family and who lives in their households. And for some of them, it's quite lonely. It's for a sustained period of time. And now that the big wide world out there in Gosport does seem quite a scary place for them. So we have a number of youngsters who attend the Cube, and that's a quiet provision where they can come in and work with an adult accessing the curriculum in the classroom. And that looks very different to each of the learners that attend there. So some need work set on Google Classroom, some are now accessing live stream lessons, which is just a fantastic opportunity for them to engage in learning as opposed to be at home too frightened to come in. We've also got our crisis provision at Spring Garden Lane, and our crisis provision are for those youngsters who are really in crisis, whether or not they're at risk of PECs or whether there's some self-harm or suicide attempts for them. So it's about actually making sure that that package is secure around them, so we can provide that educational support through Spring Garden Lane, and then put on the fantastic resources we've got there through our child and families team led by Tamara Mitchell, where we've got social workers, qualified social workers and some trainees. And we've also got a counsellor where we can provide support for not just that child, but their wider family too, because we recognise that actually when one of our learners are in difficulties, who is supporting the parents, the families, the nans, the granddads and the carers, because also we know that there is a 52-week waiting list for any CAM support, and other agencies are stretched. So when a child is in crisis and they can't access school at all, that's what we do just to support them. We've also got another range of extended curriculums, clubs and societies as well to support them in removing barriers across I'm definitely now handing over to Faye, who's going to talk about the tier 2.
Hi, sorry to disappoint you. It's not Faye, it's me, I'm afraid. But after I'm going to give you some information about some of our tier 2 support. And just in particular for us, I'd like us to take a moment to think about the role we all play towards this. As Paul was just demonstrating, we've got a range of wonderful tier 3 provisions that we have. But before students get to that stage, it's incredibly important that we've had the opportunity to explore some of our tier 2 options. Just to be very clear on what we're referring to by tier 2, this is the focused support and intervention for students, which is above and beyond what can be provided within the classroom itself. Now, there's a number of identified challenges that we have identified, which we made sure we considered before we put together our tier 2 program. We know that some pupils who are in receipt of pupil premium are not having those gaps in their learning identified early enough to ensure that they are closed effectively. Likewise, some of the pupils who have SEND or a receipt of pupil premium are not making sufficient progress to meet the end of key stage expectations. Some of our learners are entering the school with poor language and communication skills, and that in turn impacts their reading and writing ability. And as we know, learning needs in reading impacts the achievement across all subjects across the curriculum. So those were taken into consideration before we started to put together our tier 2 program. So just to be very clear on how we deploy those resources, students are routinely assessed to identify the areas of development that require that tier 2 support. Tier 2 support is all about providing the skills that learners need to be independent and successful, not only in their learning, but also in adulthood as well. It's important that there is a range of appropriate assessment tools which are used for identification and also for measuring the impact of this wave 2 support, tier 2 support. Paul and Faye have already discussed some of the Renaissance reading and maths, but outside of that, and the impact data, but outside of that, we have invested in a number of assessment tools to gather an understanding of a whole range of different needs, from communication needs, emotional well-being needs as well. So these are used before students are then chosen to access tier 2 support. The general structure is that most of the tier 2 interventions and support last for 10 weeks. We tend to run a cycle every single term. We found it's been quite important to tie together the tier 2 support of the different teams that we have. So at the moment, we have 3 teams who are predominantly delivering this wave 2 intervention. And that's the PALS team, who are providing that academic and pastoral support for children who are in receipt of pupil premium. We have the SEND team, who are running a range of wave 2 provisions across the 4 main areas of SEND, which is cognition and learning, communication and interaction, social and emotional mental health, and sensory and physical. And we also have the literacy and oracy team, which have got that particular focus around those areas. What has been really important for us this year is that we have a suite of intervention programs available. We have invested in a whole number of new intervention programs which are reputable. These are programs which have proven results nationally, and we know that these can make an impact for our young learners. Where necessary, we have been providing appropriate training to staff members as well to deliver some of that tier 2 support and interventions. That includes some of the trauma-informed practitioners Paul was talking about earlier, but we also have staff members who are trained as ELSAs and also trained to deliver the Outland course as well, which supports young learners with communication and interaction needs. Now, we're growing this support as well. We've recently employed 2 EAL coordinators who will be looking at EAL provision across the academy. That's Zoe Aspinall and Maddie Evans. They will be looking at EAL learners across the whole trust, and as well as supporting teaching staff with that tier 1 support, which they will be talking about in a moment in a more general term, they're also going to be exploring what tier 2 offers we can have for some of our EAL learners as well. So we will provide some more information for that as that develops. I think the final thing just to mention as well is about the role we all have to play towards this. What happens in these intervention groups is incredibly important for the development of these young people and how they are engaging with our curriculum. It's integral that you have a very clear understanding around which interventions your learners in your classroom are accessing at that time. We have put together some information and some data which shows the the different assessment tools that are used across our Wave 2 interventions from all of these teams. So we have a one-stop shop for that information, which we will make available for all staff. And also from a logistic point of view, you need to make sure that the learners in your class who have access to Wave 2 interventions are accessing them now. Arbor has made it really clear to support that communication method. So it's important to make sure that students are attending these interventions when it's needed, because it has been an identified need. I'm going to pass over to Paul now, who is going to be talking about some of the Wave 1 support.
Thank you. So I'm going to be talking now about our Tier 1. So as educators, we have a statutory duty to adhere to the teaching standards. And the teaching standard I'm going to focus on today is Teachers Standard 5, which is actually looking at an inclusive classroom. So within our classroom, we have many different learners with many different needs from many different backgrounds, including those of our service families, those children who are looked after or been through the care system, those with SEND, those with inclusion needs, and those who are disadvantaged. And if we can focus actually on specific groups of learners, that actually makes our classrooms inclusive for all, meaning that any learner in our classroom can have access to the learning because those barriers would have been removed in one way or another. I'll never forget when I was a leader in a primary school in Southampton, we had Ofsted. I was walked around the 9 classes I was accountable for, and I was asked which youngsters in the classroom had an educational health and care plan, which youngsters were disadvantaged, and which youngsters were lapped. So you can imagine 30 times 9, I had a bit of work on my hands there. So inclusive classrooms at the GFM. So when we actually look at an inclusive classroom, as I said, it's just about knowing our classes, knowing about those youngsters who are looked after, who are pupil premium and who have SEND, and making sure that actually as practitioners, as educators, that we are providing the best education we possibly can for them and understanding their needs, because all learners learn very, very differently. So when we have a class of 30 in front of us, we could have up to 30 different needs that we need to be able to change our skills and teach towards. And we've got loads of resources currently in place across the GFM, and some coming in soon, where we can find out about our learners. At the moment, we've moved to Arbor, which gives us a great one-page screenshot about learners. It tells us if they're SEND, if they're LAC and SEND and disadvantage, or if they have any medical needs or any other needs there. We've also got their reading ages in our Key Stage 3 Arbor as well, so we can see if there are barriers to reading. And also we have provision maps currently being set up and established, which will give us a whole overview view of the children as individuals in our class. And then we can use this when we are using our class charts, setting up seating plans, so we can make sure that children are sat where they need to be, where they can interact with others, whether they need a more accessible seat, whether they need to be sat near the front because they're hearing or visual impaired. So it just helps us then to meet the needs of our learners. Also as well, it's just taken into account the emotional well-being of pupils. So I know we're doing a lot in the behaviour blueprint at the moment, where we're actually meeting our youngsters at the door. We're having positive interactions with them. We're asking how they are and awaiting that response. And one of the things I find when I walk around school, I was in the I-room today, I asked each individual how they are, and the responses were very, very different. But it's also good just to know that information, because then I understand how they're feeling. We can understand how they're feeling as they come into our classroom. So we're more prepared. We know if they're having a bad day, because 9 times out of 10, they'll tell us in one way or another when we say, how are you? Whether it's the appropriate language or not, we know they're having a bad day, so we can then be prepared for that, and we can use on the pool of toolkits and resources we have as practitioners to ensure that their learning is accessible for them. So our teacher toolkit. So if we're looking at Teacher Standard 5 and that inclusive classroom for all, where we're taking into the needs of all learners across the curriculum, there are many different things we can use and have at our tips, which will remove some of those barriers for learning. So as you can see on the screen in front of you, we've got some different versions there. So vocabulary mat, straight away, it shows the expectation of the vocabulary those youngsters are using. So are they using the vocabulary of a mathematician today? Are they using the vocabulary of a historian or a scientist? Because that's very different for them. And we got to remember, some of these youngsters are 11, 12 years old. they may be from a disadvantaged home, they may have SEND needs. And throughout the day, they're expected to go to 5 different lessons where they need 5 different skill sets and get to know the routines and systems of 5 different adults who also talk to them in 5 very different ways and have 5 sets of different expectations. So removing some of these barriers by just using these standard toolkits, if we all invest in actually using a bank of these with our learners, our vocabulary vaults, our subject dictionaries, looking at the mini whiteboards, colourful diagrams, visuals, the use of Chromebooks where it can dictate to them or take notes, we'll just remove some of those barriers for those youngsters, enable them to be more successful within our lessons. Some of those learners as well, especially the ones with SEMH needs or communication interaction needs, also need some of those visual prompts and support. So just like a now and next card. So what are they doing now in the lesson? What's expected of them next in the lesson? And that just helps break the learning down for them so it's chunked and digestible for them. Also, another one on there is use of knowledge organisers, so they can see when they get to their lesson, if you have a knowledge organiser for a topic or for a module you're doing, they could start to look at that as they come into the lesson. Straight away, they can get into that mindset. Right now, I need to be a scientist or a geographer. Look at the language you're expecting them to use. Look at the learning they're about to engage in after the register's been done. So those things are all really useful just to make sure that actually at that tier 1 level, we're providing everything we possibly can for our learners. And if we can get it right at tier 1, that should remove some of the barriers, which would then mean our tier 1 learners move into year 2. And if we can reduce the amount of our tier 2 and tier 3 resources and need through making sure we've got the access right at tier 1, it just means that we can then provide more of the tier 2 support and more of the tier 3 support, looking at the diagnostics and being proactive as opposed to reactive, where we find ourselves in some of these situations at the moment. I can now confirm I'm handing over to Miss Harlan.
So we've talked a lot about learning, and we know that learning is a complex process and that it is to do with meeting learning needs and the kind of needs that my colleagues have described, some of which need specialist diagnosis, some of which we've developed tools to inform us about. But there's another strand of what it means to be a young person, which is around your relationships with adults. And research tells us that all children need emotionally available adults in their lives. And when I talk about emotional availability, what I'm talking about is adults who listen to them and can see them without judging them for everything that they are, seeing them in the round for who they fully are, not just as a learner, but as a full person. Adults who can be with them when things are going wrong and not panic. Adults who can be with them when things are going wrong and then start again fresh next lesson. Adults also who can advocate for them and counsel for them when things go wrong in the world and help them rebuild relationships, help them to go back and try again in situations where things have gone wrong. And for most children, that person will be at least one, if they're lucky, 2 parents. If they're really lucky, they might have a network around them with lots of adults who can do that for them. Those young people come into our classrooms with a huge advantage. But for too many of them, and particularly in our community, there are factors that disrupt the adult's ability to do that. And we know that those are things like poverty, pressures of work, mental illness. I'm not going to read them all off, but anybody who is a parent or has had the delight of spending time with a parent or a child knows how difficult it can be to meet your child's needs and be there to listen to them after a long day of work, or when things are going wrong, or when you're worried about money, or you're sick, or there are other pressures on you. And where many of our families have multiple pressures on them, you can begin to see why so many of our children are arriving in our classrooms with what is really an unmet need. So young people who don't have access to emotionally available adults will bring that need into your classroom with them. But the good news is that you, as an emotionally available adult, as somebody who has that capacity to listen, to hear them for who they are, to listen non-judgmentally, that is something which in and of itself seems simple, but can make a huge difference. And that's not just rhetoric or kind of wishing for good things to come out of being nice. We have research that informs that. So my colleagues have referred to the ACEs, ACEs is something that we probably could do another GFM talk on. So ACEs stands for adverse childhood events. And there's a whole range of things that are described as adverse childhood events. The more of them you have, essentially the worse outcomes for you. And that's one of the things that we measure for when we apply resources, as Mr. Candy has described. But the other thing that we know is that ACEs can be balanced out by things that we understand as resilience factors. And here are some of them. And we can see what this is showing you. In the middle, the graphics are the resilience factors. And the statistics around the side are the amount of impact that has. And I just want to draw your attention to this one in the middle, the trusted adult relationship. So what that's telling us is that amongst a cohort, amongst a population with mental illness, 28. So there's an 11% gap. It's an 11% difference. Having an emotionally available adult makes an 11% difference in your likelihood of developing a mental illness, which is really significant. So whatever your sense of your role in this, and we all have a role to play, as my colleagues have ably described, your role as an emotionally available adult can't be underestimated, and your potential to have a really remarkable impact on the lives of the young people we have in our classrooms is an opportunity that we mustn't miss. So I'm going to hand over to Kerry to conclude.
Thank you, Alice. And thank you, everyone. Thank you for listening. Thank you for engaging with us. I just want to leave you with the next step, really, imploring you, encouraging you to take that moment to reflect on those key messages you've heard today, and in particular, what your role is. What are you doing as a member of the GFM team to support us in achieving those inclusive ambitions for all learners across the GFM and, in turn, the town of Gosport? What we are hoping to do following this is to provide you with lots of information being sent out. Our intranet is ready to launch and will be making its way to you, and we will be able to share the materials as well. I know that any member of the inclusion team would welcome follow-up conversations, so please do reach out and please do continue that dialogue about our roles in those next steps. Thank you very much.